are such a genuine gem. Thank you for clicking on my video. I'm Brooke McKenna, but today's case is the case spread by internet for the first time, the Klaas case. Now, many of you requested to hear about this after I did the Amber Hagerman's case, where they had many connections to Polly's case. But not only was Polly's case talked about in a way unlike anything before, but it would change so much once it was finally solved. I believe her story deserves to be told. So yes, I do post so much content like this. If you don't know, it's my passion to tell these stories, and if you subscribe and watch me, it truly means the absolute world. I appreciate the heck out of all of you. So yeah, let's get back to the story. So it was 1993 in California, and the family lived in Petaluma. Now, this was the mother, Eve, and her two daughters, Polly, who was 12, and Annie, who was 6. These two girls were stepsisters and had two separate fathers. However, their mother, Eve, was not with either of the fathers at this time. She was a single mother raising the two daughters on her own in her own home. Now, at the time, Polly was a 12-year-old happy-go-lucky preteen, and she had actually wanted to invite some friends over for a slumber party that October. So she invited two of her friends, Kate and Jillian, on Friday, October 1st. And they were gonna have a night of ice cream and board games and dressing up and just like the most innocent slumber party activities you could ever do. So Jillian arrived at about 7, and her and Polly got permission to walk down to the local store to buy some popsicles. They came back in no time, and they waited for Kate to get there. When Kate got there at 8:30, it would be time for ice cream and games. However, it would end with a tragedy that no one would forget, because at around 10 p.m. a man holding a butcher knife would barge into the bedroom that they were all staying in, and he was holding a bag that contained the items to bind them. Polly's mother didn't hear their screams because 30 minutes prior she had taken some sleeping pills due to the fact she had a migraine and the girls were being kind of loud, and at 11:30 she would be woken up by Kate and Jillian, who would tell her the worst news a mother could hear, that her child had been abducted. Polly was gone. The police were immediately called, and Kate and Jillian kind of had to go over what all happened that night and recall what had gone on and the steps leading up to Polly's abduction. And they started off by saying that when the man came in through the door, he said that they needed to stop screaming or he would cut their throats. And so of course they did. Then he was asking who lived there in the house, and Polly spoke up, said that she did, said not to hurt them, but that also her mother and her sister were in the house as well. And the man started saying that he wasn't going to hurt anybody, he was literally there to rob them or to get money. So Polly was saying that they had some in a jewelry box, however he never really went for this jewelry box. This man then told all the girls to lie down, and he tied their hands behind their backs with miscellaneous items in the room. He had some cloth, and he put that around some of their hands. He also took the cords from a video game, a purse strap that he cut off, and he wrapped them around their hands. And he also took pillowcases from the room and put it over their heads. And at this point, he told Kate and Jillian to count to 1,000, and he was going to take Polly. She'd be back by the time they were done counting. He was just going to take her to find the expensive items in the home, is what he said. However, Kate and Jillian got done counting, and Polly never came back. And at this point, Kate said that she thought it was some sort of funny practical joke. It was close to Halloween, and they were all dressing up in Halloween gear, and it was just, I mean, they were teens. They had no idea that something so horrible could happen while they were in their own home. And Kate said she thought it was just a joke, but slowly she realized as she was gagged by this cloth that it was not a joke and it was not funny whatsoever. This was obviously not a robbery, however, no evidence had been left behind either, or so the abductor thought. At first, when police searched, they couldn't find anything. However, when the FBI got called in by Polly's own parents, they came in and they searched the room, and they used a ultraviolet light as well as an alternate light source, which kind of showed more fingerprints in a way that was easier to see than the equipment that the police had to look for it. And they found a partial palm print on the bed. It was kind of on the side, on the crossbar, where he would have leaned forward to possibly grab a pillowcase or whatever he did, but they had this palm print unfortunately they needed someone to match it to. It wasn't like they could just run it through the system and find who it was, who it belonged to. They needed a man to match it to. And so this is when they took Kate and Jillian in to a sketch artist to kind of get the basic outline of what this abductor looked like. Now, at first, of course, they looked into possible family members that could have been the abductor, because it's more common to have a family abduction, and it's also easier to track down. So that's often their hope, is that it is someone that the child knows, so they can track it easier. So at first, they looked into Polly's father, Mark, who of course didn't live with her or her mother. And he was almost immediately cleared. He also took a leave of absence at work to help search for Polly. He was really involved, and they felt kind of stupid for even implementing him in the case whatsoever, because he would end up being a huge factor in this case in the end and changing so many more lives after that. But slowly the investigators began to realize that this was a stranger abduction, which would mean it would be even harder to find him, because they also found fibers of the crime scene that belonged to vehicles and kind of the fabrics inside. And all of Polly's family members' cars were tested, because of course she could have been sitting in there and went to her room and that's how it got there. However, these were all eliminated, meaning that this was probably from the abductor's car. There was also a dark brown hair found in Polly's room on the rug that still had the root at the end, so it had been yanked out of this person's head, leading them to believe this also belonged to the abductors. They had all of this evidence and yet didn't know where to even start, because this was a stranger abduction. They started searching for Polly, and about 4,000 people were involved. It was a very huge search. They were using helicopters and canines, and they were searching up to 1,000 miles on foot through apple orchards and fields, and 3,000 miles in the air, just searching anywhere for Polly, and there was no sign of her. People all over the world knew about Polly's case from the beginning, and that was because normally when the media gets a hold of a case, it's spread through newspapers, and so of course it's more local newspapers that get the story and run it rather than newspapers all over the world. It really is more common to it just be local. But because the internet was such a kind of an up-and-coming thing at the time, two local residents named Gary French and Bill Rhodes went to the police department and said, look, you can put Polly's missing persons poster online and digitized. It will be so nice on there. People will be able to see her picture and the sketch, and it will be spread so much farther. And so that is actually what they did for the first time. And with the help of a computer columnist named Larry Magid, they actually spread this poster out to 20 million users within no time, meaning that, you know, this could be spread 20 million times the amount that it would take to hand a person a copy. And this was people all over the world, meaning if this abductor had taken Polly through a different state or a different area, so many more people knew about it in order to see them. And this is so crazy to think that this is one of the first times this happened. I mean, we have so many resources now online. I mean, the Charlie Project, you can see missing persons posters whenever you want. And however, this was the first big break in that actually happening in abductions and in crime in general. They also faxed posters to thousands of different supermarkets and truck stops throughout the country so they could post it on their bulletins, and the Advo flyers were also mailed out to people. I mean, 54 million homes got these that showed a picture of Polly, the sketch, and said, "Have you seen us?" These posters said that Polly was 4'10", weighing 80 pounds, with brown hair and brown eyes. And this case even reached Hollywood, where the actress Winona Ryder offered a $200,000 reward in the whereabouts of Polly Klaas. Now, Winona had grown up in Petaluma, and she felt a very strong connection to this case, which is why she did so. And this case was also featured on 2020 America's Most Wanted, and they did even updates. Investigators even went to Polly's school to talk to teachers and students to see if they knew anything. 2 days after Polly's abduction, her father would get a call. And when he answered, it would be Polly's voice on the other line, and it would say that Polly was at a hotel and that her abductor had kind of stepped out of the room, and that's why she was calling. However, the line then went dead, and this couldn't be retraced because of course his phone lines weren't set up for that at the time because he wasn't expecting it. Eventually they came across another witness, and it was a boy named Thomas and his friends. Now, they had gone to the video game store at about 9 p.m. the night that Polly disappeared, and they had seen a man outside the Klaas residence, and Thomas knew everyone in the neighborhood. Everyone knew everyone in this neighborhood, and he didn't know this man, and when they walked back through, he was still there. He was said to be a white male between 32 to 45 years old, from 5'10 to 6'3, with thick wavy salt and pepper hair and a full beard and a full face. He was also described as having a slight age lines on his forehead and around his eyes. But the next witness's story would be the most eerie of all. They were the neighbors behind the Klaas residence, and they would look out the window to see a man at the back door of Polly's home, and he appeared to be like he was going to go in. However, he didn't. They had never seen this man before. They thought it was super strange. However, they didn't want to get involved, and they didn't call the Klaas residence or the police. Mark then got another call, and investigators had been at his home waiting for this to happen again so they could trace it, and it was Polly once again on the other line. They traced it immediately, and it was only 14 miles away, so they immediately headed over, barged into the home, and saw a family, and they were completely confused. Polly was nowhere inside, neither was kind of a man matching this description, and then a young teenage girl confessed that she had been the one who had been calling as Polly due to a dare from her friends. Now they had no Polly and no suspect. However, little did they know they had already come in contact with Polly's abductor once. Then a ransom was demanded of the police department, $10,000 for the return of Polly, and they didn't give this money. They, in fact, traced this to an apartment in Petaluma where a 20-year-old James Hurd was shocked to see the investigators barge in because he was a fraud. Polly's parents were getting desperate, but they weren't losing hope. They were writing into newspapers saying, "Whoever you are, wherever you are, please return Polly to her family. She belongs here. We miss Polly so much. We miss the twinkle in her eye and her sweet humor. We long to see her beautiful smile and hear her musical voice. Our darling, if you can read this, please know that your mommy and daddy love you so much, and we will continue to search for you until we can hold you safely in our loving arms again." Her mother Eve even said, "I have a daughter out there without shoes, and she burned a candle in her window every night that Polly was missing." But the police didn't know that their answer was in their own records the entire time. And that was because the night of Polly's abduction, the police had been called out to the property of Dana Jaffe, and she lived about 20 miles north of Petaluma. Miss Jaffe had headed home late from work. It was around 11 p.m. to her babysitter and her daughter. And of course the babysitter left at this point and headed down the road, still on her private property, when she saw a car, and it was kind of stuck in the ditch. Immediately headed into town to call the payphone to call Miss Jaffe and tell her to get out of there or to be safe, because when she had come across this car, a man came up to her, basically stopped her and put his hands on her hood, telling her to get out of the car. When she refused, he asked her kind of how far the next town was and what was up the road, and this babysitter could smell his body odor, his bad breath, and just got a really bad feeling about him. Just drove away after that, just kind of leaving him there on the side of the road. And he scared her so badly that she wanted to call Miss Jaffe and tell her to get out of there, and she did. She grabbed a baseball bat, she got her daughter, and she headed down the same road that she had to take to leave, except for the man wasn't there. It was just his car, but she did get into town and call the police anyways. 11:46, the police were called for the abandoned car, and they got there at about midnight. And when they got there, the man was back near his car smoking a cigarette. He was sweating profusely, even though it was a pretty cold night, and they asked him why, and he said he was putting some kind of leaves and brush underneath his tires to hopefully get some traction to get it out. However, when the police looked, there was nothing by the tires or around it at all. And he simply said that he was going to meet a relative in Redway Valley, and he stopped to look at the view, and that is when he got stuck. Now, all of this would have been a huge red flag to investigators, of course, if they had just been called in for an abduction, which they should have been, because the time lined up, this was about the time that the abduction would have been heard throughout the radio for police, except for this certain police station was tuned into the wrong frequency at the time, and they didn't hear about it at all. Officers could tell that the man in front of them was intoxicated. However, he passed all of the sobriety tests, and then they ran his driver's license in their system, and it came back all clean, no records found. However, this was not the truth about the man in front of them, but at this time, all that was really found when somebody ran a driver's license was driving violations and not all criminal activity. So all they found were driving violations, and he had none. So they really had nothing to hold him on, especially when the owner of the property, Miss Jaffe, said she didn't want to perform a citizen's arrest on him. She would have to do that herself and go back. And of course, because she has a daughter, I'm sure she didn't want to go and do that. And so an hour later, they were calling him a tow truck. They searched inside. They only found some beers as well as a duffel bag, and in fact, this man tried to drink one of the beers while they were standing out there. They made him dump it out because, of course, he was going to be driving, but he really didn't seem to care. And at this point, the police obviously started to search him even further because he was acting weird. That wasn't normal behavior to see police and be like, oh, I'm going to drink this beer while they're watching me. So they searched him again, and yet again, they found nothing. So there was literally nothing they could do once that car was unstuck. They drove him to the highway, and that's where they separated from him. So how does this connect, you may ask, if you don't already have it figured out? Well, 2 months later, Dana Jaffe, the owner of this property, would be calling the police once again. It was November 28th, and she had found something she believed that the police needed to see. She led the officer to a place where loggers had partially cleared the trees. There on her land was a piece of silk cloth that was kind of looked like it was made into a hood. There was also strips of packing tape and a torn pair of ballet leggings or tights, and they were in a knot with human hair inside. Dana had a horrible feeling that this somehow connected to Polly's abduction, and that she had come, or her babysitter had come face to face with a killer, and she almost did as well. And now investigators had a name because, like I said, they ran his ID through the system that night. They had it on record, and his name was Richard Allen Davis. The cloth found on Dana's property also looked to match the one found in Polly's bedroom, and now they needed to find Polly, who they feared had been murdered. Yet they searched all around Dana's property, all around the area, and even in a heavy rainstorm, which of course makes it even harder because evidence can be washed away. It's harder to see, and we know how much that can hinder an investigation. However, they continue to do so, and they continue not to find anything. So at this point, they turned to finding Richard himself. Now, he had the reason to be in Petaluma because his mother lived there, and he also very much resembled the sketches. And they tracked him to an Indian rancheria near Ukiah, California, where his sister lived. They got there and he wasn't there, so they kind of set up roadblocks around the area in hopes that they would catch him before he got there, before he could run away, before he saw that they were there to find him. And in fact, this is what happened. He pulled up in a van, and one of the officers asked for his ID, and it was in fact Richard Allen Davis. And so the police immediately came, swarmed his car, and arrested him. Except they didn't arrest him in Polly's abduction because they didn't have all that much evidence against him just yet. But they did arrest him in the probation violation that he had for a drunk driving arrest previous to that. November 30th, they began to interrogate Richard in Polly's abduction, and he denied having anything to do with it. However, Kate and Jillian were brought in to look at a lineup to see if they would pick him out, and they immediately did. Without a doubt, it was Richard in their minds, and the partial palm print that was also found and kept was matched against Richard, and it was in fact a match. Then the evening of December 4th, Richard would say to investigators that he screwed up big time and he wanted to show them where Polly's body was. He took them right off of Highway 101 in Cloverdale, California, and to Polly's body. Her body was pretty badly decomposed at this time, and her skirt was kind of pulled up a little bit, but her underwear and bra were still on. Next to her was a rope and a knotted cloth, thought to be how she died and how she was strangled. And semen was also thought to be found on her body. However, they couldn't confirm that there was any sexual assault that actually happened. However, the evidence showed a story that Richard refused to admit to. Richard said that night he'd planned to go to his mother's, but he couldn't find it. He was so drunk, and he continued to drink beers. He also did some drugs that he bought on the street. He continued walking. He then had his bag with him, and he began to cut strips of cloth with some scissors before taking his duffel bag, finding a random house, and climbing in an open window. The next thing Richard said he even remembered was that he had a girl next to him in the car who was complaining that her bindings were too tight, and then he got his car stuck and he took her out of the car, put her up on an embankment, told her to be quiet as he tried to get the car unstuck, and that is where he said Polly was the entire time he was talking to police. And then when they escorted him onto the highway, he waited 15 minutes before going back and picking her up, where he then took her to a gas station to go to the bathroom and quickly realized that he couldn't let her go because he didn't want to go back to jail. Richard also always referred to her as a broad rather than a young woman or the child that she was, and refused to say that he sexually assaulted her. And the Once Upon a Crime podcast actually said a very good theory in the fact that this could probably be because in prison, convicted child rapists or child killers will kind of get more punishment from the other inmates, and possibly he was trying to spare himself that. Now, this leads many to believe that this wasn't the entire truth or the entire story, and that Polly was not alive when the police came to get him unstuck, that she was already murdered by that point. Regardless, though, he was in custody and they had the confession they now needed, and in 1996 Richard was brought to trial, where he then said he definitely didn't sexually assault Polly because of something she had said about her dad. And he said Polly had said, "Just don't do me like my dad," insinuating that her father Mark had sexually assaulted her previously. And obviously this made everyone, including Mark, so extremely angry that he was trying to place blame on somebody else, and just, he was a sick man. No one for a minute believed that her father Mark could have done anything so horrible to her. He was just trying to get a rise out of everybody. I mean, Richard was doing anything to taunt the victim's family. He was also putting up middle fingers to the camera in the courtroom. But he was found guilty on June 18th, 1996, after 10 weeks of deliberation for robbery, kidnapping, burglary, murder, and attempting to commit a lewd act on a child. And because of his actions during the trial, he was actually sentenced to death. Now, I always like to go into the past of the killer once they're caught, because, you know, maybe this could say what led up to this unfortunate event. And Richard was born to two alcoholics. By the age of 11, he was already abusing and harming animals, which is a huge red flag. And the next year, he would be caught stealing and would say that he pretty much just gave up at that point on life, on doing anything right. And at 21, he was sentenced for burglary from anywhere from 6 months to 15 years. But he only, in fact, got 1 year. And in fact, 7 weeks after he got out, he was kidnapping a woman at knife point in a parking lot, took her to kind of an abandoned area, and tried to get her to perform certain acts. And she grabbed the knife, she got out of the car, and she started to run. And she, in fact, got away because there was thankfully a police officer driving by at the time who got out, helped her, and arrested Richard right then and there. He tried to end his own life in this jail sentence, and he was sent to a psychiatric hospital where he escaped and for 5 days committed a series of different crimes. And when he was caught, he told the judge he had no remorse for his crimes whatsoever. And in 1983, when Richard was serving 16 years for another crime he had done, I learned from the Once Upon a Crime podcast that at this point there were actually laws being changed due to overcrowdings in prison, where these prisoners were getting out after they had served half their sentence just so they were out of the jails. And at this point, Richard had served 8 years, meaning he was going to be released. His probation officer said that this man should be removed from the community, talking about Richard. However, in 1993, he was still released, and 3 months later, he would abduct Polly Klaas. The night before Polly was abducted, like I said, her friends were all dressing up, trying to find their Halloween costumes, and Polly had put on white makeup with kind of black eyes to look like a dead person. Was this just a strange coincidence, or did Polly somehow in some way know her fate? But Polly's case has led to so many wonderful things happening in the criminal justice system that it's insane, that I'm not sure why her case isn't more widely talked about because of this. I mean, her own father created the Klaas Kids Foundation and is always willing to help parents of abducted and missing children. And because of Polly, officers can now see all criminal activity when they pull you over for driving violations. When they pull it up, they can not only see your driving violations, but they can see all criminal activity, which can ultimately help, because we know in this case it could have changed everything. And the 3 strikes law was actually created because of this case. And if you don't know what that is, it's basically that if a criminal commits a serious felony, they are given a mandatory life sentence. If they have been convicted 2 other times, 3rd strike, they're out. So basically it means that if people are willing to commit a crime 3 times, they deserve to stay in prison, which I think is a brilliant law. And yes, the name does come from baseball's 3 strikes and you're out, which I think is very cool. Polly was known to everyone as America's child because everyone knew about it and wanted her to be found safely, or just found in general. And thankfully this case is solved, which is incredible. Unfortunately, I wish it would have been a different outcome, but her parents did go on to do so much to change how missing persons and abduction cases were solved and were just investigated in general. And like I said in the Amber Hagerman case, they also helped with the creation of the Amber Alert laws. Polly's mother, Eve, says, "I would like her to be remembered. Her story should result in the community coming together in a way that shows just the very best of humanity." Winona Ryder, who had given reward money in Polly's case, went on to star in Little Woman and had it dedicated to Polly Klaas. She said in the years after that, after Polly's disappearance and murder, she couldn't really take any dark roles because of Polly's case and how it affected her so deeply. Richard Allen Davis is still on death row at the San Quentin State Prison, and he has been attacked by several prisoners there. He also has survived an overdose, and he is said to now be in solitary confinement. But I'd love to hear your thoughts on this case. I think that it truly is one of those just life-changing, world-changing things. And I'm just happy that although Polly had such a horrible end, that it did make a difference, because I think that's what we all hope, that in our lives we can make a difference. And so glad I got to tell her story, and not just everything that came after her, but what she was like and who she was. So yes, don't ever forget to speak up. Your voice is powerful enough, and I love you to absolute pieces. Okay, bye.